Avery and everybody else, but everybody worked really hard yesterday. There were a lot of dedicated people. Most of you are back here today. I mean, I thought it went really well, and the homeowner was just tickled pink. And you know, Pat said, "So how did the process go?" Well, teaching is also about teaching the process, not just the individual things. It's managing the process. So when we make a commitment to a homeowner to get a window out, get it restored, ready for paint and back in and weather stripped in a day, by God, you know, we get it done, right? So, but managing the process also goes back to when I did my first apprenticeship. So when I did my apprenticeship with Robert Krebsbach, who was a German guy, probably originally Scandinavian, but multi-generational German from Hamburg. It took me 3 months to beg my way into the apprenticeship, but I finally got in, and it was a 4-year apprenticeship. And halfway through German apprenticeships, you present a toolbox that you build outside of his site during the first half of the 4-year apprenticeship. And then, you know, big German meal, my folks come. I've got this toolbox I built. It looked like the Empire State Building. It was Art Deco. It had secret drawers and ebony wheels and inlaid silver in the drawer fronts, all hand dovetailed. I mean,
Do you still have it?
Well, I'll tell you. Hang on. So I build this thing, and I'm like, you know, it took me 2 years to build this because I had to work too, right? And so he's a little short German guy, and his English was really bad. I can't do the accent, his, you know, German accent. But I take the sheet off of it, I show it to him, and he's all over it. And he's popping up, he's going around looking at every little, and popping back up and going, "This is the finest any apprentice has ever made." And I've had apprentices since I was 30 years old, and he was 72 at the time. And I'm like in tears. You know, my dad's there. You know, hugging my 6'10" dad was like this, right? But I was hugging my dad, and I hear this horrible noise, and I turn around, and he's turning it into splinters with a small sledgehammer. And I freaked. I went after him. I was pissed. You just told me it was the best you'd ever seen, and why are you, you know, screaming at him? And my dad's holding me back. And he said, "I've done this to every apprentice I've ever had. And I do it for one reason, to make a point, is that you're no craftsperson. Craftsperson is somebody that does the finest work, which that was, in an efficient and speedy manner." And I have never done that to any of my apprentices. But we talk about being efficient in our work and thinking 20 steps, 50 steps ahead and understanding how we get from one place to another. Because there are a lot of people that build nice things, and I said some of this yesterday. But the truth is that they're really not craftspeople unless they can do it in an efficient manner. So in preservation, it sort of gives preservation a bad rap because you usually got a couple of local people that are doing it without a lot of competition. And that's on the preservation movement. We should have been doing what I'm doing, what I've been doing all my life, and trying to get the National Trust for Historic Preservation to put up money to start getting people to go out and train people. And it's happening more and more. But the efficiency part of it is how the unions and the artisan guilds of the past, the wood turners guilds, the carpenters guilds, and all those different things, they taught that kind of almost German way of thinking, you know. and I just, it's sad because I don't see it like I used to. But what has happened in the last 10 years has been astonishing to me. So I was afraid, as many of us in this business were, that young people wouldn't come in. You know, everybody yanks on millennials, right? That they're like lazy and they don't have a work ethic. Well, I got to tell you, it's sort of not true. It may be true at some level, but we're seeing droves of 20-somethings and 30-somethings coming into the preservation trades now, and half of them are women, which really makes my heart sing because women, now, this Harvard professor gave a lecture and he says, you know, Bob Yap says that women are better at the artisan trades than men, but he has no science behind it. You know? And I'm like, no, I don't. I just have 46 years of experience. And so oftentimes what happens is that fathers don't spend the kind of time with their daughters that they do with their sons. I mean, that's just sort of the way of the world. But I find that when women get a chance to learn that way of thinking, let's call it the handy way of thinking, that their skills often exceed men. That is my opinion. Sorry, guys.
It's true.
I have all daughters.
I'm out of here.
You know?
I got 3 daughters, and they
You
all.
didn't know this was a cross-dressing class.
Boys just want to get it done, and the girls just want to take their time, and it'll be nice when it's finished.
So I go back to all of this. The trades, the preservation movement in this country was very much, in the beginning, kind of an exclusive club, kind of a blue, the old stereotype, the blue-haired lady, dames of the revolution kind of thing, and for a long time it was. And a guy named Richard Moe, I call him the Big Moe, became the president of the National Trust for Historic Preservation back when I was doing my PBS show, and they sponsored my PBS show. And he was in awe of the trades. He understood that the preservation movement dies tomorrow without people learning these traditional skills, because we have all these historic houses. You can call it the preservation movement all you want, but if you're not preserving houses and sustainably and doing good work, it's not going to happen. So when I was a little kid, my dad was a corporate guy, flying all over the country, but he'd come home, for a weekend every so often when we were kids, and he was an old house weekend warrior and a woodworker. And so I'd just take any chance I could to go down and shop with my dad. And I'm standing there with him at the bench, and he very nonchalantly says, Bob, we don't own this house. And he goes back to work, and I'm hanging. I'm like, what? I start crying. We're going to move. I'm 6 years old. Why are we moving? He says, we're not moving. You go down to the county courthouse, and they'll tell you we own this house, but don't you ever think we own this house. It's our job to do really quality work on this old house that you love and your mother loves and your brothers love. Really quality work that lasts, so the next family can enjoy it as much as we have. And that's my father was a conservative Republican, and that's a very conservative notion. Lay on it, baby! Oh, that's the same part of my dress, same creek that goes up the hill. At 3 o'clock in the morning.
At least that one has a locomotive.
Yeah, we had an issue last week.
Wasn't that railroad?
Oh,
What happened?
we had a runaway train.
Literally.
It crashed and flipped.
And hit and
Anything hazardous?
line.
No.
I'll show you pictures later.
So it's a really conservative notion to preserve things. And it's interesting, people have talked a lot about over the years about preservation being, I've heard this many times, it's a left-wing conspiracy to take away my property rights. Well, my dad, he was a property rights guy, but he also understood that it was his responsibility to take care of that property so people could enjoy it besides us. We aren't going to live there forever. And that house today, it just looks like it did when I grew up when I was 6 years old. And people take care of it. It's got a clay tile roof, with balconies. It's a brick arts and crafts era, probably 4,000 square foot house, beautiful little house in Des Moines, Iowa. And so it does matter. And when I hear my conservative buddies say that, we always have a conversation, and I tell them that story, and then we're actually having a conversation instead of beating on each other, which is really important. Because preservation doesn't take away property rights, it creates them. That's what a lot of people don't understand. So you have areas here where if you're going to do something to the outside of a building, you have to go to your Heritage Commission? Is that what you call it?
Yes, Martha's a member.
Okay, good. And Heritage Commissions, when they're doing well, are collaborative. They're working with them. They're letting folks know that they're having meetings so that people know what the rules are, and instead of being the police, the preservation police, are being the preservation collaborators. It's one of the things that I train historic preservation commissions with all the time. So Just to give you an example, I bought this big slum apartment building and turned it into our school and our bed and breakfast. Now, all these preservation ordinances are just for the character defining features on the outside of the house. And in many cases, the ordinances are just where you can see it from a public right-of-way. So I go and I keep all the character defining features, and I add the ones that are missing back on. And the slumlord next door vinyl sides the brick house and puts vinyl windows into it. Well, he just took my property rights away. He just took my property rights away because he devalued my house by 15% when he did that. Now, there's a fella named Don Ripkema, who, by the way, is a Republican, and he has a company called Place Economics, and it's out in D.C. And he analyzes how lots of different things, but one part of his business is preservation. He is not a preservationist. He's a real estate economist. And he travels all over the country. He's done more studies in Missouri than any other state. He's done a lot in Iowa, Illinois, a lot over on the East Coast and all that. But in the Midwest, Missouri has more studies. And it shows that if you have a house with character, whether you have ordinances for the exterior or not, design guidelines, if you have a house that has original exterior, the house is going to be worth it from 12 to 17% more than if it didn't, number one. And number two, if somebody next door to your classic exterior is doing something like I just described with vinyl siding over brick, oh my God, I mean, I couldn't even believe it, that it can lower your property values from 12 to 16%. So when we talk about property rights, I love this because I'll get called by a city to come in and go into an angry crowd of property rights people that want to decertify a local historic district. They don't want to be in one anymore. And they always hire an attorney, and I come into the meeting, but I find out who that attorney is. And guess where they usually live? In a cornfield new development, right? And they have covenants. So I pull up the covenants from his neighborhood, and I put it up on the screen, and I put up the design guidelines. And the covenants are way more restrictive than preservation ordinances. But you guys are all second-class citizens. You live in the central core of the city where all the historic properties are, so you don't have the same rights as the guy that lives in the cornfield development. I mean, that's what they're telling us, right? So when they say this, I think it's important to turn it around and look at it from a different perspective. That, a town like St. Genevieve, a town like Hannibal, where I live, our lifeblood is historic preservation. Our lifeblood are the pre-Civil War and post-Civil War structures in our town that show the progression of our architecture. Even that little ranch, see that little ranch house, that mid-century ranch house right there? About 2 years ago, I listed a ranch neighborhood on the National Register of Historic Places in South Bend, Indiana, that was between 1946 and 1952. And they're these killer California ranches, and some of them are these funky all glass houses and stuff. But when a neighborhood or a house is over 50 years old, they start to become more eligible for these kinds of designations. But we need to keep this because we need to know what the progression of our community was. And one of the biggest things that I've run into over the years is, well, we don't want to list that house or that neighborhood because that's just worker housing. Oh my God, what is wrong with people? Who built these communities? It's the workers that built these communities. So the small worker house is just as historic as the big banker mansion. And I've had this fight with commissions over the years. In Rock Island, Illinois, I found this little house that everybody in the neighborhood, this was a National Register neighborhood, but with no local controls whatsoever. They called it the Rabbit Hutch because it had been overtaken by rabbits. But it was this cute little story-and-a-half worker cottage, and it had a little mansard roofed front porch on the front of it, and originally had cedar shingles. The shed, a kitchen on the back had rotted away. We had to rebuild it. But anyway, I wrote a local nomination to make it an individual landmark. And the city's staff and the commission voted unanimously not to list it. Well, the history behind it was that the biggest developer in downtown Rock Island, Illinois, where I was at the time, was a woman. She built all of the commercial buildings downtown up until about 1900, and she was a madam. And I also restored her whorehouse, by the way, which is really an interesting place. And she built 24 of these and gave them away. And each one was a little bit different. She actually plastered the half story, and the staircase was almost like a winding staircase to get up. It wouldn't meet code in a day, but with a historic listing, we could keep that stuff. So I appealed to the city council, because in Illinois you can appeal to the city council. In Missouri, I think state enabling legislation says that if the commission, if you want to override a commission's decision, you have to go to court, which is different. And I think that's the way you guys operate.
We have an appeal process, but basically if you don't like the decision, you have to go to circuit court.
Right. Because the decisions that heritage commissions and historic preservation commissions make are quasi-judicial. What does that mean? Well, that means that they make decisions based on the rule of law, the rule of evidence, and they have a legal underpinning to what they do. So we appealed to the city council, and they unanimously landmarked that house. And that changed everything in Illinois. Suddenly, the Illinois State Preservation Office and all of the commissions were now taking a look at worker houses as being as significant to the progression of architecture in a community. Do you have a lot of worker houses here? You're on the commission, right? Yeah. Do you have a lot of worker houses here?
Sure we do.
Yeah.
Yeah, slave quarters.
Right.
Those are worker houses.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Free worker houses.
Yeah.
So I say this because I think it's important to have a little bit of a background about where the preservation movement and where we dropped the ball, where Dick Moe, who headed the National Trust, it's interesting because when PBS came to me and said, we saw your pilot, I said, I never did a pilot. And I'm like, what do you mean? We love it. And I'm like, you mean that thing I did for my radio show? I was on 420 stations around the country as the house doctor. And we were on from noon to 3 on Saturday afternoons. My syndicator said, you should make a video. Because it's radio, it gives people a visual. So we made this thing. My wife Pat and I did it together, and that's the pilot apparently that somebody sent to PBS. So I went out to DC, and they said, well, you've got a show. It'll be on every station in the country, and now you have to go get the money. And I'm like, oh, thanks. Because we ran the numbers. It cost $2 million a year to do the show. So I've been working with the National Trust for Historic Preservation for many years, so I went to them, and Dick Moe was all excited. He said, let's get this out to the average old house owner. This is great. So it went to the board, and half the board went, oh, no. This is an exclusive club. We're not going to let this Bob Yap, is that really his last name? Bob Yap from Iowa have a show that competes with our Bostonian show, This Old House. And the other half of the board agreed with Dick Moe, and that we need to get to the average old house owner, because I teach practical preservation. That's what I do, And it was a tie, and to break the tie, the board agreed to send out the video to all the ex officio board members. Those are people that used to be on the board or are real famous, so they wanted their name on there. And one of them wrote this letter, and he said, here's the deal. I'm from the Midwest. You will be the first underwriter for this show, or I will resign from the board and write an editorial in the New York Times about it. It was Walter Cronkite. I never met him, but I would have hugged him. Boy, he really made the point, and so that's how we got started with that. But it's not an exclusive club, and that's what Dick Moe understood. It needs to be, it doesn't matter whether you're in a district or not. If people understand that keeping character defining features increases the value of their house and increases the heritage of your community and the understanding of where we came from, then it makes sense. So Anybody have any questions about that? What do you guys think about your ordinances?
So far, so
About
good.
our what?
Yeah.
Ordinances.
Your preservation ordinances?
I wish they were a little more strict.
You wish they were
Mm.
stricter.
Made more inspections about stuff that you do, because I've had people say, "Oh, don't worry about it."
We'll do it over the weekend, city.
Yeah, they're not even going to inspect it. And it's like, well, I'd rather they did.
I
What's
don't
it?
think we have any zoning.
We don't
I mean, you
either.
can
Well, we have minimal
you
zoning,
can
but
have
you know.
We do have
Oh,
zoning.
yeah, certainly.
How come there's trailers?
Oh, we have trailer parks all throughout the center of Hannibal.
But they're really old.
It's called non-conforming.
Right.
Ah, oh, I got one of those.
So it's sort of what we
Did you
refer
mention
to
it?
as grandfather. Like, yeah. So yeah, all towns and smaller towns have a little looser sometimes zoning ordinances, but you usually have a pretty good commission of people from the community and that understand or try to understand. Staff usually runs our. Are you staffed to the zoning commission too?
Yeah.
What else are you staffed to?
So Heritage Commission, Zoning Commission, Rental Advisory Board, Public Housing. Those, well, that's different, but yeah.
Well, that's a lot of staffing, my friend.
Small community.
I know. It's the way it works. Same thing in Hannibal. We don't even have a city planner in Hannibal, and we're 18,000 people. And we hire these young Turks to be the city manager, and they're not planners. It's different. It's a different animal. If we had a city planner, the position would pay for itself because we're leaving millions of dollars of community development block grant money on the table that we could be using to help with neighborhoods and that kind of thing. And if you declare your neighborhood as blighted, you can get community development federal block grant money without a tie to income. So then you can create programs that help low-income working families, lower middle, and upper middle. Because the one thing that I've learned is that you cannot turn neighborhoods around without all the economic stratas and ethnic diversity. And we don't have a lot of ethnic diversity in Missouri. Hannibal was 30% African American slaves until 1865. That number dropped down to 0.5% within 6 months of the Civil War ending. And they all ended up in Des Moines, where I grew up, which is interesting. But we do have economic diversity. Hannibal has a lot of very poor people that have lived there since they came from Kentucky in 1829. And but there's no programs to help them. And I think that working poor families have the right to live around beautiful things just as much as anyone else. How many people have heard of Habitat for Humanity? So when that first started up, I had Jimmy Carter on my radio show about it. I was pretty excited, because he was a former president. He just left the president. I had him on the show, and it was a nice interview. But I was really disappointed as time went on because what that ended up doing, it has the highest repossession rate of any low-income housing program in the country. Failure rate, which is sad. Part of it is that there's not enough training for people. If you grow up in public housing, you don't know about mowing a yard or taking care of your house or anything like that. So they make these, usually a lot of single mothers come in and they do a little painting and that kind of thing, and then they get a house. It's not enough commitment. Is what they're starting to find out, and they're making the changes so that they can get to that. But it is the poster child for bad infill housing in this country, which is sad. Now, it also depends on the community and the board of the local Habitat for Humanity. Some are doing rehab work on old buildings in bigger cities, but most of them are building these little mini ranches, and they'll plop them in the central city on a lot next door to a Queen Anne or an arts and crafts house, and it looks like the mother alien ship has landed in the neighborhood, So it's a wonderful organization, so we work really hard with them around the country, a whole slew of us, to get them to increase the wall heights on the houses, increase the, they bring in trusses. Well, let's get a little steeper pitch on them, and let's not surround working poor people with vinyl. because it's the most toxic consumer substance ever created on the planet, and people don't understand this. PVC makes asbestos look like you should put it in your cereal in the morning. 40% of the people that die in house fires in this country die from toxic off-gassing from this and that vinyl window I showed you yesterday. So at 160 degrees, I got to get windows and lead that. 160 degrees, this becomes a toxic plume. So in the 1980s at the MGM Grand in Las Vegas, they had a fire on one floor. And lots of people died in this fire. And not one of them died from smoke inhalation, and not one of them died from being burned. They all died from toxic off-gassing from PVC, plastic doors, vinyl wallpaper, and the carpets, all the different plumbing things. So it all got overheated, and the toxic gases got to the people and killed them. And that's when the environmental movement started taking a little bit of a look at PVC. So if you ever want to watch it's one of the reasons that it's one of the many reasons I hate this crap. But if you want to watch a fun documentary that won at Sundance and all that, it's called Blue Vinyl. It's not a porno film. It's called Blue Vinyl. Out in New Jersey, this girl, her mother took a drug during the 50s called formaldehyde, I think.
Thalidomide.
Thalidomide, I can never get that, thank you. And she was born with some female problems and had to have a hysterectomy when she was 17 because of it. So she was involved in some big class action lawsuit and got a nice little payment for it. And her parents lived in this ranch in a neighborhood. Everybody put vinyl on their house but them. They had this really nice cedar siding on the house. It wasn't peeling or anything, but they were getting ready to move to Florida to retire. So they had to put vinyl on it or they didn't think they could sell their house. And in a neighborhood like that, they might have had a point. Because in small ranch neighborhoods, if they're all vinyl sided, a lot of people like that, you know. And she said, well, what do you know about it? And they're like, what do you mean? Well, I mean, is it toxic or, well, we don't know. We don't care. We just want to move to Florida. And so she took a piece of this blue vinyl they were putting on the house and she went all over the world with it. And she went to Italy and watched all the executives of the PVC industry on trial for colluding with the American Vinyl Institute to lie to the Italian public about the toxicity of this stuff. She went down to Baton Rouge and New Orleans, where all these huge PVC plants are, and all the workers are dying of this horrible liver cancer. And then what we found subsequent to that documentary is that installers of vinyl that are cutting it are also dying of this cancer. So it's really interesting. I'm not a big tree hugger, but I think it's important that we understand what the environmental impacts are, what we do to our own health and to our community's health. So it's one of the reasons I don't like vinyl siding. So replacement sidings started very, very early. This was the first one. Now, when this went on your house, you knew the neighborhood was on the upswing, right? No. This is called Insul brick. I had it tested. There's no asbestos. It's what we call corn board and tar. Corn board made out of corn fiber. And then asphalt here. Now, the vinyl industry couldn't let that go. They had to come up with their own. What I love about this is that it's painted in the factory. Pass that around. Just riding around in my case, you can see the paint's already coming off. And it's not through. If you look at the edge of it, you can see that it's painted. So I've taken that crap off of houses so many times. I have a program that I do with my company where we go into a community, and it's called the Great Unveiling. And we block off the street, the city lets block off the street, put tables down the middle. We hire clowns and magicians to entertain the kids. People potluck for lunch. 40 people show up with pry bars, and we take off all the vinyl and aluminum siding, sometimes even asbestos slate, in a morning on 3 houses that are next to each other. And then the local electrician will give us a lift or whatever so we can get up in the peaks. And then all afternoon, after we've skinned these 3 houses, I give talks about how to get long-term paint jobs and how to do wood repairs and things like that, which is what we're going to be doing today. The next one was this. This is lovely, isn't it? So this is asbestos slate. It's very thin. The binder, it's cement board. The binder is asbestos. What do you notice about the face of this? What do you see?
Streak.
Streaks. They'll look like wood grain. Right? Every replacement siding tries to fake something. Right? So this is modern cement board. This is hardy plank. And the binder is fiberglass, which I'm sure the EPA will eventually ban as well. But this is an unbelievable product that's been around since the 19-teens in this form. It's a little thicker today, but now you can get it in a bevel, like a piece of bevel clapboard instead of just flat. They make it that way. And what do you notice about the surface of this? Wood grain. So how many clapboard houses have you ever seen painted where you can see the wood grain? Well, maybe this one.
Few.
But you can't even see the wood. You know, you can't. So you can buy this smooth. And most people don't. They buy it and so you see the wood grain.
Well, how are you going to catch dirt if you don't have grain?
That's right. You know, and mold spores and stuff like
Right.
that, you know.
Does that come even thicker, Bob? Because somebody put something on my schoolhouse in the facet area, and it's very thick.
Yeah, there's some companies that make it about another even
Like an
quarter
inch.
inch thicker.
Yeah.
But that's too much weight. So I restored this Second Empire, which is a mansard roofed house in Rock Island that was built right after the Civil War by a Union captain. And before he left, he had built what I call a Louisiana sharecropper's house on the back of the lot, you know, where the roof comes out over the porch. And it's just classic style, and that's what he lived in. Went to the war, came back, and made some money and built his big house on the front of it. So the city in their infinite wisdom decided that because there was some termite damage to the sharecroppers back of it, they had that torn down. I've never done a house anywhere in the Midwest or anywhere in the center of this country, south or north, that didn't have termite damage. I just have to figure it into my numbers. It's just part of it. So they tore it down, and we reproduced it exactly as it was. There was enough photographic documentation that we were going to do that. And then we built a reproduction carriage house in the back. Now, I don't use this on the main house that I'm restoring. If I have cedar clapboard or pine clapboard, whatever, I use wood clapboard on the house. Even if I'm doing an addition on the back, and I'm picking up massing and detailing to make it flow but not look like a lie. That's another thing. A lot of commissions that I work with, they're very adamant that when you do an addition on the back of a historic house, it should look like the historic house. And that's just the opposite of what we recommend. We recommend that if you do addition on the back of a house, that it pick up setbacks, massing, detailing, but make it a little simpler or what have you, so it's not a lie. It flows with the house, but it's obviously an addition. I have been fooled. I bought an Italianate, brick Italianate with this, what I thought was an original back to it, and I started digging around, and it wasn't even, it had beautiful stone, cut stone foundation around this frame thing on the back of it. I thought, well, it must have been the summer kitchen, or the kitchen area. There was one stone laying on the ground. There was no foundation. And we found this out in the dead of winter, so we had to jack it up, tent the whole thing up, and get all these propane heaters and pour a foundation underneath it, and then put the stones back on. So making it look like it's always been there is not a great idea. So we built this carriage house about 7 feet away from the back of the house, because we had to have a little bit of a setback from the alley for them to be able to get in, so we had to get it pretty close to the house. And it's not attached, so we sided it with this. Some kids burned 4 garages and that carriage house one night. Now set them on fire. And it burned, it melted the cars inside this carriage house. It melted my buddy's entire woodworking shop. I mean, his chop box looked like it just drips on the ground. It was that hot. And the whole thing never fell down and the hardy board kept it 7 feet away from the main house. Not one scar on the main house because of this stuff. So, fireproof. This had 2 paint jobs on it when it was torn down in 2003, excuse me. 2 paint jobs since it was put on originally on a house in 1920. It holds paint for about 50 years. So it's an amazingly good product if it's used on auxiliary buildings that are not attached to the main historic house in my opinion. So that was the second main replacement side. And then aluminum, I don't have a piece of aluminum, but aluminum was huge. It was 98% of the market until vinyl started to come along. Now this is a piece of vinyl that was put on a place in a burb outside of Chicago. And of course it has wood grain in it. They all do. No, this is the piece. It was like a big condo thing with direct southern exposure. And this piece came off. This was from a rock chip coming off a lawnmower, and all this warpage happened in direct sunlight over a 2-year period of time. So if you drive by vinyl-sided houses and look at them, the siding's warping. If you get a rock chip in it, it fades, so you can't match it back up again. It's just not sustainable. And you can paint a house twice for the cost of vinyl siding if you do it right. So it's just not something that I think is a good product for us to use. Anybody have any questions about that?
Yeah, what about all the PVC water feed lines
Yeah.
that they're going to have to replace just like they did with some of the PEX, the original PEX, the red stuff? Is there going to be a government program for that? Because
Well, I don't know.
that's
You know,
poisoning
all
a
of our
lot of
drain
people,
lines now
just
are
like lead.
PVC. In Chicago, you couldn't use PVC drains until 7 years ago. The plumbers union
Oh,
fought it because they were putting in cast iron,
right.
and they made more money
Of
doing
course.
it. And finally, they got around the union and started using it. I don't know. There isn't a great alternative to that, but using it for water lines is nuts.
Yeah, they use
First of all,
CPVC.
PVC is so rigid, and if it freezes, it's gone. It can bust, and you know, hot water heaters are running what 140.
140.
Remember, that stuff becomes toxic at 160. So if you're cranking up your water heater a little bit, you could actually have toxic off-gassing from the hot water lines from PVC. You mentioned PEX, and this is
Yeah.
really interesting. So PEX has been around in Europe for 50 years. And when it came to this country 20-some years ago, California immediately banned it. So did Massachusetts. The 2 states that have the most hardcore environmental laws in the country are Massachusetts and California. So I'm taking notice of this because I'd seen it all over Europe when Pat and I went over there, and those other women I used to be married to. And I'm like, okay, if California's going to, so they took 2 years of testing on PEX, and what they found was that it had no toxic leaching whatsoever, that it's totally recyclable. All right, so they then made it legal. There were some problems with some of the red early on, but that's,
It would burst at the joints because the rings they were using would cut into the PEX with pressure, and then they would just burst loose in your walls.
so the crimpers have changed, the rings have changed. There's different ways of attaching it now. They have these what I call shark tooth fittings. Don't use them. You know, just friction fit onto the pipe. I know they say they'll hold more pressure than copper, but I'm dubious. So we use crimpers on them. I never used it until I bought this house in Hannibal, and every stick of water line in that house is PEX now. I was able to put a hole at the bottom of a plaster wall, a hole at the top, fish it up through the plaster, across the hall ceiling and down into the bathroom on the other side without a single joint. This winter, you remember when it got down way below zero for a week? That was brutal. You guys had it too, I think. We had 1 bathroom freeze. And here's the beauty about PEX, is that it freezes, it can expand, and then as it melts back down, the pipe comes right back to where it was.
Have you ever seen one frozen?
Yeah,
Swells up like a snake that ate a rat,
I know.
Really?
and then it just goes right
Go
back.
right back to where it was.
What does it stand for? What-
PEX,
I did the
It's
school
another
house.
one of those dang acronyms from the construction industry. I don't.
Is it a plastic?
It is a plastic.
Yeah.
It's a
Like a
vinyl.
tube.
It's not vinyl. It is not vinyl.
It's not vinyl. It's okay. The original
It's-
red was.
Poly.
It's polyethylene or
Yeah,
something close to
yeah.
that.
Okay.
And that's why California, because California banned.
Oh, PVC was polyvinyl chloride.
Yeah, that's right.
It can be blue and red, but
Okay.
It's a flexi clear.
yeah, I did the whole thing. I've never
What,
done
what,
plumbing in
what?
my life, and I did school house. It was so easy.
Cool.
Yeah,
Blue.
so
Yeah.
you can get it blue, red, or white. So for
Oh, I like the red.
so for hot water lines, I run the
Red.
blue or the red, generally the red, and then for white, for the cold water, I run the white. But what's nice about it too is that there's a manifold
Yeah.
that you put down in the basement that shuts it off to all these different zones. So if we have a guest room that froze, and old houses, this happens. I mean, there's no way you can stop all this from happening. I can just shut off that room, and all the other guest rooms are still off.
You can shut off one sink.
That's exactly
Yeah.
right.
With that diaphragm, you have toilet, west bathroom.
Everything.
That's
Sink,
exactly
west
right.
bathroom hot. Sink, west bathroom
Yeah.
cold. And it just goes down the list like that.
It's almost
it
it's
looks
almost like,
like-
a breaker box in
Yeah,
a sense.
it
it's
is.
exactly. It's
With
gorgeous.
little
Yeah, I
valves.
love it. It's really good.
So I like it a lot, and I'm using it now exclusively. I was sweating copper all my life. In fact, last weekend at Old House Maintenance for Women, I taught them how to sweat copper. And you'd have thought that was the coolest thing in the world. Here's the problem with the plumbing section of that class. So I'm showing them what a dielectric fitting is. A dielectric fitting takes a copper pipe that you're joining to an old cast iron pipe, and it keeps it from having galvanic action, which is an electronic current from two dissimilar metals, and then it wrecks the softer of the two. So the softer of the two, of course, is copper, and so it's a dielectric fitting that's on there. Then they sweat a piece of copper and an elbow on that, and then they're doing it ends up being this long thing. And 2 years ago, I did this class, and this woman had flown in from California to do it. And I said, well, we'll just leave them all here. I'll reuse all of them. Oh, no. We're taking them home to show our husbands and boyfriends. There's no way I'm not doing it. I said, you don't want to fly with that. She got a full body cavity search. They thought it was a pipe bomb.
That's hilarious.
She called me up when she got home. And I'm like, okay. But I've had a full body cavity search because of that. I used to take that hard shell case over there and fly to do seminars.
Yeah.
And they thought it was some sort of infrared bomb or something. They didn't kiss me or smoke with me
Didn't even send you
afterwards.
flowers.
Terrible.
No flowers.
Nothing.
No candy.
It's like when I did my yearly old guy thing. Are we going to smoke now? And he says, you say that every year, and it's still not funny. But, so anyway. Yeah, so there are new products that are good, but not everything that's shiny and new is good for old houses. And that's what we have to think about. Part of the problem with old houses that people worry about a lot is insulation. Now, in Hannibal, we have a lot of brick structures. Yours was frame, I think, wasn't it? Or was yours?
Mine was Queen Anne frame.
Yeah. And
And they
brick
blew
stru-
in. I think they blew in at some point because there were holes on the outside. They did.
all those
blow in.
fashionable little plastic plugs.
Uh-huh.
Those are lovely. So I've never blown insulation into the sidewalls of a frame house in my entire life because I'm going to give you the extreme example. There's a little town upriver in Illinois from us called Nauvoo. Nauvoo is where Joseph Smith ended up lighting with Brigham Young, Mormon. So anyway, it's just interesting. So I have a contract with Nauvoo to go in and help them as a consultant with they're all frame houses. Joseph Smith's house was built in 1848, right off the Mississippi River.
So it's fairly new.
Yeah, it's new compared to what you guys have here. And they were having trouble with the paint peeling off his clapboard and that kind of thing. So I spec'd out all the painting, and they painted it. They took it down to the bare wood, what I'm going to describe to you today. And they cleaned it and they painted it, and it started coming off in sheets. So I show up. There. I show up there with this. This is called a moisture meter. And this one is idiot proof, which is why I own it. It sends a wave to the center of the wood, and it tells you exactly within 1/10 of 1% what the moisture content is in the wood. And you can adjust it based on the species of wood. So all the ones that I use, I have the little code that you plug into it for all the different, everything from red oak to black walnut to Doug fir, red cedar, all these different types of woods. And the settings are based on the density of the wood. So I put the moisture meter up on it, and everything's over 60% moisture in the wood. Now why does that matter? Well, it matters because if you paint wood that's over 15% moisture content, you don't get failure in a year or two. You get instantaneous paint failure. You cannot get adhesion with that much moisture in the wood for anything. Now, it might be a little drier on two sides of a wet area, and it's holding it there, but eventually that center part comes off in sheets. So, I said to the maintenance guy, is there blown-in insulation in this walls? Because you guys told me there wasn't. And he said, no, there's not. I said, he's about 50. And I said, do you have an older guy that used to be the maintenance guy? He said, yeah, he's like 95. He would love to come down here and talk to you. So bring him down. So he comes down. He's all excited because he's out of the house, and his wife had died, and he didn't have anything to do, and suddenly he had something to do. And I said, did you guys blow insulation into these sidewalks? Absolutely not. I said, okay, fair enough. And you have to remember, thousands of people go through Joseph Smith's house a year. They have no climate control in the house. So all these sweating bodies are going through it, right? So I took a big old drill bit, and just above the sill beam, I drilled in through the siding, and through the sheathing underneath, and into the wall cavity between two studs. We found where they were, the stud lines. And I pulled the drill out, and it took 20 minutes for the carpenter ants to stop coming out of the hole. And they ate the entire white oak 9x9 sill beam. So the whole house ended up having to be jacked up. So after the carpenter ants quit coming out, I reached in and I pulled out a gigantic wad of blown-in cellulose insulation, and I wrung an entire cup of water out of it. So when I was doing the PBS show, we went around the country to all the different zones and to houses that were having paint problems that had blown-in insulation. Same exact issue.
Wow.
Now, how can that be? Well, this, I did this instead of clapboard because I thought it was falling apart a little. Anyway, this is the interior side of the wall. Now I can't use cellulose because it would all fall out, so I put fiberglass in. But here's a lath and plaster, right? So we have plaster over the wall, and in old houses, an empty wall cavity with actual air movement in the cavity. Now we create warm, moist air inside our houses. People don't think about this as much as they do wind-driven rain can get in or what have you. But the most moisture damage that we get in old houses is from interior moisture. Dishwashers, plants, showers without good fans, things that people do in their bedrooms that I'm not going to talk about. But we create a lot of moisture, right? We create a lot of moisture in our houses, and in certain areas more than others. And it doesn't go up, it doesn't go down. The way convection air moves, moisture-laden air goes through the walls. It finds hairline cracks in the plaster, a gap in your baseboard, outlets, all those kinds of things. Gets into the wall cavity. If the wall cavity is empty, it dries out right away. If there's blown-in a cellulose in the wall, it hits the cellulose, it condensates all over, it wets it down. It sends out a no RSVP needed invitation to the termites and the carpenter ants to come and party in your wall. And it creates black mold and every kind of horrible thing you can think of. So, if you're going to keep your original plaster, which is a thermal mass, meaning more so than drywall, that it actually helps retain heat in a room rather than dissipate it. It's just like brick. A solid brick wall is a thermal mass. So as you're heating up, as this heating season starts, and I tell my wife she can't turn on the heat until Christmas, but she always gets it on in October. So it heats up the brick, and it retains that heat and helps keep your energy efficiency. And then you start to get into late January and February when it gets really cold, and it wanes a little bit. But if you build a frame wall in front of that brick and you insulate it, you're actually going to increase your energy costs. We did a study of this for the Main Street program in Iowa, and the amount of BTUs you use just having plaster right on the brick is less than if you build a wall in front of it. Plus, moisture can wick from the brick into the insulation if you get it too close. You almost have to be 9 inches away from the brick if you build that wall, and that takes up a whole lot of that floor space. So it doesn't make a lot of sense. So in new construction, they require that you have an open stud wall, you put the insulation in, and then you have to put a 4mm plastic vapor barrier over it. That keeps the warm, moist vapor from getting into the wall cavity and wetting down the insulation. And that's on the inside of the wall. So you don't have that in an old house. So if you're sitting in your Barco lounger and your butt's getting a little cold from the radiation of the cold in late January, when the walls don't hold the heat as well, move your chair away from the wall. That's the best thing to do. Because blowing insulation, even if it didn't have any of the problems that I described to you, the average payback, that's when we pay a certain amount to have something done for an energy retrofit, and we expect to save enough money to pay for that over a period of time. So in the construction industry, anything over a 20-year payback is considered not a payback. The average payback for blown-in insulation is 42 years. 42 years. It's the same thing with windows. 43.5 years is the average payback. And since most replacement windows end up in the dump at 20 years, good luck with that, right? So we just have to think through these kinds of things. The problem with replacement siding is that they don't just put this up on the siding. They put in backer board, which is an insulation board, because they need a flat area to lay this on. When they were putting on asbestos slate, they would take wood lath and put it on right here so that it would create a little bit of a flatter surface. But it actually breathes. It's so rigid. And they didn't put backer board that moisture could escape around and through this type of product. Where it's just, when we do this, aluminum siding or vinyl with the backer board, we've created a vapor barrier on the wrong side of the wall. Right. What side of the wall does the vapor barrier go on? Inside. If you do this on the outside, it traps more moisture and causes more moisture damage than you can imagine. It's the #1 reason for catastrophic paint failure in America on old frame houses is blown-in insulation. And when we went out and tested all these places,
Yeah.
You do? The previous... Oh, that's why your paint is bubbling.
Shut up!
That's why your house painted, the whole thing.
You tested foam
I might as
insulation?
well just burn
yeah,
it.
so
Burn it to the ground
Do you
right
have
now.
insurance fraud? Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
so the
I
question
blame you, Dave.
Okay, I'll
the
take
question
that.
was the question was foam insulation. What about foam, right? Because maybe that's another alternative, right?
Uh-oh.
No.
Oh, no. What about on the
So
roof
here's the
line?
deal: if you've got a plaster wall and they're going to put foam into the wall, they'll drill in and they'll put and they blow the foam in. And what does foam do when it gets in an area? It expands. So what we have is catastrophic plaster failures all over the country where this was done, with what we call pillowing. So it goes in, it expands. They can't control the expansion,
Right.
and it pushes the lath nails off the studs, so that the wood lath is no longer attached in the areas where they got too much in, and the plaster starts coming off. It's also not reversible. So remember how yesterday I talked about reversibility if you're doing stuff? So I have a friend in downtown Hannibal. Her name is Christy, and she's a real estate agent. And she bought a nice 2-story party wall building. That's where the buildings are attached to each other. And she shot this foam up into the rafters of the building, so she could have open rafters. Well, it looks like baby poop on the ceiling. She painted it brown. It's really nasty. And when she did it, she said, "I'm really excited because it doesn't shrink, you know, and all this." It does two things. First of all, back in the 70s, they were putting foam insulation in the sidewalls of old houses, and it had so much formaldehyde in it, the federal government banned it because it was making people sick. You cannot make foam without formaldehyde. So now they have this foam, you know, closed cell, open cell, isonine, soy, all these different foams, but they have to have formaldehyde in order for it to actually work. So it's just below the EPA's maximum allowed amount. They say, you know, formaldehyde free. Well, it's not. It's a lie. It's up to the EPA's maximum standard. And it does shrink. Her foam shrunk a 1/4 inch away from all of those rafters within 6 months. In fact, I use her ceiling in a PowerPoint that I do for energy efficiency all over the country. And you know Christy.
I
Gervais.
do. I bought my house from her.
Yeah,
Oh my God.
yeah.
Just spring
She's
it
an
into
empire
the upper
builder.
rafters. Just below the deck board.
Yeah, the roof line.
In Florida, and covering the whole thing. And I was doing a loss replacement valuation, WDO, 4-point, and windstorm mitigation inspections, and I would see these. We couldn't even write the house up because when the roof fails, you can't tell it on the inside.
If you have a leak, you'll never know. If you
Until
blow it
it
into
rots
the
in the spot
rafters,
If you
It's
get the
big.
closed cell, it won't go through. The open, it's supposed to go through.
It
Not when they
doesn't.
spray it solid because it comes out with just a shiny coat.
so you can't identify it. Plus, the formaldehyde, wood has a couple
You have to
things.
scrape everything off.
So here's a piece of
Can't scrape
wood.
it.
This is a piece of southern
You
yellow
can't leave it
pine.
on electrical.
And it
Can't
has
do anything.
dark, hang on now, you gotta pay attention.
We're just talking.
I know. The dark lines are what we call winter wood. That's when a tree hunkers down in the cold, and then it has, and the lighter, there's a couple of different, it's hard to see without a magnifying glass, but in between the dark lines is the spring and summer wood. Formaldehyde eats the spring and summer wood, which is where some of the rot resistance in wood exists, and it starts to do this. It starts to eat into it. And so it's hard to get it out, it's hard to reverse it, it can cause damage to the wood, it can cause you not to know where you're having roof leaks and those kinds of things, and it can cause pillowing in the walls. So what's the solution? The solution is quit whining and quit putting insulation into the sidewalls of frame houses. You know? Stop the air infiltration. That's your #1 issue on old buildings. Excessive air infiltration. We go through and we every pipe going through a floor gets caulked around. You know, all these penetrations going through, everything gets caulked. Every piece of ductwork gets insulated, and you know, we weatherize our windows and doors, and we put tons of insulation in the attic because a building is like a chimney, and the air and the warm air, not the moisture-laden air. That's the convection makes it go this way, but the warm air will come up through the building. And so, you know, you want an R42 or even higher up in your attic space if you can get it, but not foam. We use blown-in cellulose or blown cellulose or fiberglass, that kind of thing. And there's some more environmental things that are actually taking rags now and making some insulation out of old rags, which has some nice R value to it, which is recycling. So that's kind of cool. So that's where we do that. The other thing is you got to look at your heating system. So we have our main house is 8,000 square feet. The slave house is 2,500 square feet. So a total of 10,500 square feet heating and air conditioning. And when we bought the house, it had slumlord furnaces. Like they poke a hole through the brick wall with a little gas furnace, and they put unvented gas things in the fireplaces and window air conditioners. Our house never had central heat until we bought it. Never had central heat. And for the 2 years before we started doing the hardcore restoration, our average monthly utility bill was $1,600 a month. that for heating and air conditioning, that's a lot of money. And so we put in geothermal. And in our side yard, which is half the size, about the size of this area right here, are 10 250-foot deep vertical wells. And the pipe goes down in, picks up the 52-degree temperature, comes back up 4 feet below the ground, it goes over to the next well, down, it's a closed loop, comes in, it extracts the heat from the 52-degree temperature in the liquid inside the piping, and for air conditioning, it's like virtually free, because 52 degrees is really easy to convert. It runs like a Prius, which blind people hate Priuses, by the way, because they're so quiet. There's no outdoor compressors. It's all inside. You can hardly hear it run. We put in zoning, so we have flue dampers on the supplies that supply the heat and the cold. But we also have flue dampers on the return airs. That's a big mistake a lot of people make, is that they only put them on the supplies. But if you do that, then the cold air return's constantly sucking heat out and not putting some in that room, so you have to do both. And now our average monthly utility bill, heating and air conditioning, 10,500 square feet, is $292 a month. That's a huge difference. You know?
Yeah.
So, and there's all kinds of different ways you can do that. But air infiltration's your number one issue. Now, for paint failure, the number 2 reason for paint failure is pressure washing.
Did you do that?
Strike 6?
Which causes number 1 failure.
No, I haven't done it. I have not.
You thought about it then. You gonna
Yeah.
pressure wash your new paint job?
Come on.
A little crosstalk. So, this is another thing I was able to do with PBS, is go around the country. So we picked a company, we called the Preservation Organization in Minneapolis, St. Paul, one in Kansas City, one in Louisville, and one in St. Louis. So we had 4 towns to get a nice cross section, you know, a little bit southern Louisville, and then up in the upper Midwest. And they gave us the name of the best preservation painter in town, and we went and visited them all. And every single one of them was power washing at 3,200 pounds per square inch, the exteriors of these houses. And they all had the matching shirts, and their fans were all painted up. And so talking to the owners, we're interviewing them for the show. And they're like, yep, we power wash because it's the best way to clean, and takes us less time to scrape and prep because it blows off a lot of stuff. And we let it sit in the sun for 3 days, Bob. We let it dry down because we're responsible painters. We're like, cool. So 3 days in the sun, we come back, they're priming, right? And we test it, everything's over 30% moisture. Everything's over 30. Sometimes it can take months for a power washed house to come down to 15% or below moisture content. You know, these moisture meters are important. This one's $400. You can buy this at Lowe's for $40. And this is a pin. And you just stick the pins in there. It's not nearly as accurate. It's not as calibratable, but it'll get you close and let you know what's going on for a lot less money. So power washing drives moisture into the wood. And it takes more than 3 sunny days, guaranteed, for it to dry down below 15%. And I run into these painters. I saw you do that on PBS, but you know, I've been a painter for 40 years, and I can just walk up and put my mojo on the house and tell you that it's dry enough to paint. And I'm like, what? And how are your callbacks? Well, I'm having trouble keeping paint on my houses for more than 3 or 5 years. I never forget. I go to I'm certified by the EPA for all their different things for lead, and not asbestos, because I don't like to deal with that. Other people can do that, but I'm around lead all the time, so I have to be up to date and certified on it. And the feds came out with this 1-day class that every painter, every window installer, every siding installer, and every remodeler that worked on anything before 1970, I want to say 72, it might be 76, had to take this 1-day lead course. You know, the basic safety and how to keep your clients safe, and then you get a federally certified and all this. And the fine was $35,000 a day for anyone that wasn't. Well, in 2016 that went away, which I think is sad in some ways because it's a good course. So I just went and took it because I teach, right? I wanted to see what it was like. And the guy's like, here's the deal about power washing. If you power wash a house, you have to create a dam outside. So you have to take 8 mil plastic and you have to take 2x6s and build up like a pool along the side that your power washing can contain all that water. Whatever, right? It's functionally impossible. Then he said, when you're blowing the chips of paint off and it's windy, you have to go all over the neighborhood and find the chips of paint. None of this is possible. I said, well, if you could collect the water, what do you do with it? All this lead water. Well, you just put it down the toilet. This is like insane. So John Roberts, who's a guy in Hannibal that has a company called John Roberts Power Washing and Painting, he's in the class. And when the guy said, so what I'm trying to tell you all is that it's illegal to power wash houses with lead paint on. He went bad shit. He went people are holding him back. You're taking away my business and all this. We go outside to lunch, and John says, I just can't believe it. He said, but your paint jobs last so long. Mine only last 3 to 5 years. I said, well, what's your moisture content? He says, well, I don't know. I said, well, that's your problem. Your power washing. He said, you can't tell me that. I've been doing it for years. I said, yeah, but you're telling me that your paint jobs only last 3 to 5 years. And all that does is drive this industry because people go, oh, I can't keep paint on my house. Right? So, my paint jobs last on average 20 years, which is a lot different than what yours used to. Here's another example of power washing I want to show you. This was power wash, 3,200 pounds per square inch.
Yeah. Can't you get power washers with a different PSI though?
You can lower it down a little bit, but if you power wash anything over 800 pounds, or 800 pounds per square inch, it'll
Nice wood grain. They can make vinyl like this. You can braille. It's like braille.
So here's a piece. We did this at 900
It's for blind
pounds.
people, so they know
It's blind
it's wood. This is eating away pretty good.
Really?
900 pounds per square inch.
Right here, yeah, that's what's considered.
Houses around town that look like that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Soft, yeah, it's good. It's soft and lightweight.
Like pine.
The heartwood and the sap, the heartwood and the sapwood on West Island.
Can you use a 45-degree angle sprayer?
How long they will take.
Well, I'll address that.
Really?
Bob, can you use a 45-degree angle sprayer with?
Yeah, there are different tips you can use. There are different pressures you can use. But the bottom line is that it's soaking the hell out of the wood, and it's just not a good idea.
So there's no pressure washing that. What happens?
So according to the EPA, it's illegal to pressure wash unless you can contain all the water, and you can't. So it's illegal, and nobody knows it.
What if you lived in an area like, let's say, some parts of Florida, or some parts of Louisiana, Texas, where the humidity doesn't ever get low enough that you can dry out there?
Don't say anything really important.
Is there a chemical you can put on it to leach all those, or whip the water out of the?
Not that I'm aware of. It's just it's a tough nut. Oh, is it potty time?
Apparently.
Yeah.
That's our potty machine.
Yeah, if you have to go to the restroom, I apologize.
Just drive her over behind the house.
Yeah, just. Hey, I lived off the rim of an outhouse for 5 years. I'm fine with that.
Just getting off my ankle for a second. Bottom line is that we learned a long time ago that if we're going to paint a house that has more than 3 full paint jobs on it, so if you're looking at primers and paint, you could be looking at 6 to 9 layers of paint. that you have incompatibility of paint layers, and this place just shows it like crazy. All this failing paint is latex over an old oil. You can see all the mold on it, that kind of thing. If you've got more than 3 full paint jobs on a house, in order to get a sustainable paint job, you need to take all the paint off down to the bare wood. God, you just keep groaning at me.
I just hated my blown-in insulation house.
Is it peeling yet?
Well, I do have a couple bubbles.
Did they pressure wash it?
I don't know.
I'm sure they did.
I'm sure they did. A lot of painters do.
I want to ask you about something.
Okay.
I got a picture.
Uh-oh.
Well, I was sitting in the living room watching TV.
You have to speak so everyone can hear you.
Oh, I was sitting in the living room watching TV, and I heard this sound that you don't want to hear. You know, it was,
A dripping sound?
and we had all this, 2 feet of snow on the house, and I had a 4-foot icicle hanging off the front. And this was a dripping sound, and it was the front wall.
It's a raccoon taking a piss in your
No,
wall.
I was told there was nothing I could do about this, but yeah, this was after the fact, but it ended up in a wet spot.
Okay, well, I have no idea what I'm looking at here.
Yeah, well, that was just after it dried.
Okay.
But I couldn't determine where it was coming from. I went upstairs, opened the closet, but I could not visually access it. But I first, contacted Ed and Lauren, and I said, "Has this ever happened, to your knowledge?"
Every
I'm
homeowner should
concerned.
have one of these,
I'm concerned.
because this will find where your leak is. Where you have a drip isn't always where it's coming from. And this will follow that moisture line and get you up to that bad flashing around a chimney that's 40 feet away from where it's actually dripping into the wall. So a moisture meter, especially this type, because it's harder with a pin, because you got to stick the pins into it and everything, and it doesn't work as well. But this sucker, you just follow it right along. I also have one that's designed for masonry. It works really great on old plaster. So you find a dry spot and it gives you a base number, and then anything that's over that is wetter, and you can just follow things. This is made by Wagner. They've been making moisture meters and meters of all different kinds for years. I don't know if that helps you or not.
Because I said, well, it's not something that's going to happen on a regular basis. I'm sure it was due to the ice, but I'm concerned, just with the age of the house and knowing what water does.
Water is our number one issue on the outsides of houses, managing water. So what I want to show you is this. This is a piece of old pine clapboard, and this was power wash, and this was hand wash with this right here. TSP. This is synthetic TSP. We always used to use the red box, and it doesn't hurt your flowers, but it gets into the groundwater. It hasn't been banned or anything, but it can affect local groundwater. So it's I was dubious when they came out with fake TSP, but it actually works very well. Yeah, so you put like a half a cup of this in a 5-gallon bucket of water, and instead of power washing, there's an old-fashioned tool. This is what it's called. It's called a scrub brush. Some people may remember this tool. This one goes on a pole, and you can actually hook a hose into it, so water just comes out easily, and you can scrub down things. Or you've got just a standard scrub brush. So this
They have
was
those brushes that rotate
power
now, too.
washed. I'm gonna walk this around. This was power washed. And this was So hand cleaning is the way to go, and then we rinse with cool water afterwards. And if you let that sit in the sun for about 3 days, it'll get down below 15%. And the maximum pressure that I use on the outside of a house, and I'm always going down so I'm not coming up under the clapboards, is a spray nozzle on a hose. That's it. Even on masonry. So power washing masonry, even concrete. I see the guys at McDonald's power washing and their concrete sidewalks and driveways and stuff at all these different places. And all that does is take the hard shell off the top of the concrete and eats it away. You know, as concrete cures, if they didn't make it too wet, if they make the concrete too wet, then it'll scale off on its own without even power washing it, because it's just not as hard. And power washing can wreck concrete, stone, brick, you name it. Not to speak of sandblasting. You know, back in the 70s, everybody used to sandblast brick. Well-meaning, right, to get all the paint off. Well, not every building that was painted should have the paint come off. So in Hannibal, the drunk Scottish Kentuckians that founded Hannibal, one of my favorite ones was Moses Bates. Now Moses Bates was from the Paducah area, and when the New Madrid earthquake happened after the turn of the 1800s, it was the biggest earthquake in American history. Changed the course of the Mississippi River. It shot the water back up the Missouri and flooded all these towns. It even changed the course of the Missouri River coming into St. Louis. It was an amazing thing. And Moses Bates shows up in Hannibal on a keel boat, and there's a federal agent. And he says, look, all my family's farmland was taken out, all of our homes. You need to give me some land. So they gave him Hannibal. Moses Bates was a schizophrenic that escaped from a mental institution in Paducah, Kentucky after the earthquake.
So he had no family.
And nothing. He was just bad. You know what?
That's great.
I know! So, the original slave auction house in Hannibal had a brick like livery built onto the front of it. Or the retailers would take their buggies and horses down during the day and put them in this big livery, two-story livery. And then it became a car dealership, and it was a car dealership up until about, I don't know, 8 years ago. And they moved out to the burbs and put it for sale. And one day, front page of the paper, city buys a little car dealership to tear down so that they can park tourist buses there.
Right. Oh, yeah.
And a whole bunch of us marched down to the city manager's office and said, "What are you doing?" He said, "Well,
That's a great
we
building.
talked to all the retailers, and they said we should tear it down." I said, "What retailers did you talk to?" "Oh, you know, out on 61. That's where all the strip malls are." "You didn't talk to anybody downtown? All these people that have spent tens of millions of dollars restoring these buildings and having all these businesses that tourists..." "Well, it didn't seem like important to me." I said, "You need to stop this nonsense right now, and we'll get somebody to buy the building back from you and restore it." And so some friends of ours bought the building. They spent $1.7 million building it out, and they were going to call it the Moses Bates Public House. And I love this, right? And everybody in town said, no, you got to call it the Mark Twain Brewery. Yeah, we have Mark Twain Cleaners, Mark Twain Cement Company, you know, and it's like the Moses Bates Public House. I thought that was just the coolest thing. It's called the Mark Twain Brewery. Anyway.
In San Francisco, we named our sewage treatment plant after George Bush.
John Dillinger stole a car from this car dealership, so there's a lot of history.
Oh, it's a good thing you're already down there.
So part of that original slave auction house, the stone part towards the levee and the river, is still on the back of this building. And the guy that built it is the guy that owned my slave house attached to the back of my house, a guy named Beebe. That in Mark Twain's biography, he talks about Beebe like he was the most evil guy that ever lived, which he sort of was. But anyway, so here comes Moses Bates, and then a guy named Glasscock, another Scottish Kentuckian, came up and realized this guy was schizophrenic. And he bought all of Hannibal from him for like, half a cent per acre, that kind of thing. And he's the one that platted Hannibal and all that. So these guys all come up. We have terrible clay in Hannibal. And they built these awful brick kilns, and the slaves were like trying to make bricks. I have fingerprints of slaves in the backs of almost all the bricks on my house, which is just fascinating. And they couldn't figure out how to fire bricks properly. So the workers started building their Greek Revival worker houses in the mid-1830s, and the brick was disintegrating, almost melting away within 3 to 5 years. So the big robber baron bankers and lawyers and all the railroad people and lumber barons in town are watching this. And Mr. Lamb, my guy that built my house, or his slaves, Henry, built the house. He was the first big robber baron house in Hannibal, 1859. And they went over to Quincy across the river to the German community, because the Germans made really great brick. And they were, we'll buy all of our brick from you. And they got chased out of town at gunpoint because they were slave owners, and those Germans weren't having it. And we're not selling brick to slave owners, and chased them out of town. So Henry, the slave that lived in my house, came up with a solution for all this soft brick. And Lamb, my house was the first one, new building that had it done. They took the same lime wash that Tom Sawyer got his buddies to paint the fence with, and they took all that crappy brick that was no good, and they ground it and pulverized it and added it to the white lime wash. Every single brick house in Hannibal, up until about 1869, 1870, was painted the minute the mortar dried with this red lime wash. When Twain came back in the later 1800s, everything had been painted white with lead paint. And he called it white town grousing. It just made him sad, that all of a sudden everything was white. Where'd that come from? So that saved the brick on my house. And so when we did paint analysis on it, and I do paint analysis on every historic house that I do, not every historic paint color was something I want to use. But even if I don't use the original paint color, I will use something, period. But we were able to get enough of the lime wash from up underneath the eaves and areas that didn't, get washed away. We have it analyzed, and we painted that brick with a lime wash that's identical to what was painted on that house originally. And a lot of my students come and say, "Why'd you paint your brick?" Well, I just explained why. And that's why so many brick houses. There's a house across the street from me in one direction, and across the street from me in another direction that were built in the early 1870s. And they're natural brick because they finally went downriver, got better clay, and built a proper brick kiln. And so those houses are natural brick, the later one. So not every house building that's painted should have the paint taken off. And we had to take that lead off because it was not allowing the moisture to come in and out. The good thing about lime wash is that it allows 100% vapor permeability, so moisture can come in and get out of the brick as it's supposed to on a continuous basis.
Does it hold up to the weather?
Yeah.
Mine still has it under the paint. There's
Yeah.
lime wash
Yeah.
under it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's on a clapboard.
that.
No, on my brick schoolhouse
Oh, does
here.
it? Yeah.
Yeah.
So maybe they had crappy clay down here too.
Well, it was definitely soft brick.
Yeah.
I don't know about the clay content.
So I painted ours with the lime wash in 2010. And it looks like I painted it yesterday. So it's perfect.
How about painting a house with lime wash?
So, yes, it can be done. Absolutely. The one thing that I would avoid like the plague is linseed oil based paints. Linseed oil, one of our dear friends down in Hannibal, he and his wife, Janice and Joachim, wonderful artists. They're in the highest end juried shows in the country, and they just do amazing stuff. She's a jeweler and he's a painter. And he also does other things too besides painting. He's an interesting guy. I like him. I think he grew up in
He's Swiss
Switzerland?
Italian.
Swiss Italian, yeah.
Born in Switzerland and then grew up.
His dad was a concert, like a conductor, symphony or something like that. Anyway, interesting couple. And he does, he wants to be authentic, so he does he gets this all backs linseed oil.
You have to say he bought his house for $2,000.
Oh yeah, right. Yeah, well, most people do.
Yeah, in Hannibal.
and he painted it. He did a great job painting it, and it's gone. It's been up for 6-7 years. It's gone. It has molded. Every spore from every tree is stuck to it. You can literally see the studs in the wall from the outside because the molds took more
And
to.
he hand tinted it
Oh,
with natural
God, he worked
pigments
so
and the
hard
Lucio,
on
and it
this.
took forever to dry. And it was, I mean,
And it never does
it's
really
just
dry.
the whole house he's done like that, but oh my god.
Yeah. So he and I are going to confer and try to figure out how to save that. So we want to say, and then linseed putty. So this guy named Albeck from Sweden shows up at a preservation conference about 10 years ago. And he's got his booth, and he's sitting there, and he's like, I sell pure linseed oil. My linseed oil putty and paint is so pure, I can eat it. He starts eating the putty. And I'm like, this guy's got to be a charlatan, man. This is like so over the top. It's unbelievable. So, a whole bunch of people in the business, in the window business, and the painting business started buying into it, especially in New England. And it's just been an absolute nightmare. The putty just molds and it just never cures properly because it's, in boiled linseed oil, they put dryers in so that it dries properly. And it's a different animal than raw linseed oil. So it's just something that we try to avoid. Anybody have a question?
Well, you're differentiating that, the putty, the glazing putty that we were using yesterday,
Yeah.
being what boiled linseed oil.
Right.
So you're making that distinction.
There is a
between that
distinction. Right, and you shouldn't buy raw linseed oil and boil it
I was gonna say.
and, yeah.
because you will blow your house.
Talk about the wall.
The transition color.
Yeah.
So I got a
Sunglass. Whoa.
Can everybody hear him?
No.
Not if we're talking
Yeah.
about
When you ask a question, stand up so everybody can hear you. I'm sorry.
All right, so you were talking about the insulation moisture barrier. So I got a building on Main Street, it's brick, and at some point before I bought the building, it hit the plaster interior, and they had converted the walls out like half an inch, had this insulation on there, and then put the moisture barrier on the inside, then drywall.
So, okay, so it's a good question. What if you've got a house? I have a house right now that I just bought across the street from me. That when we took the drop ceilings out, there were no plaster ceilings left. They were gone. The plaster, there are brick issues that we have to deal with, and the plaster has come off all the brick. So we've gutted this. I don't like to gut. I like to keep original materials, but nothing was adhered to anything. So we've gutted it. Now, on the exterior brick wall, I will not insulate it. Because if the insulation's close enough that I keep enough room in that space, it's a very narrow side-by-side duplex. Each side's narrow and deep. The insulation can't get anywhere near that wall, so I can't do that. But if I had a frame house and I got it and there was no plaster left in it, and when we finished gutting it all out, you can insulate that and then put a plastic vapor barrier on it and then put drywall over it, just like new construction. So you can do that. And there was a big movement during the late 70s all the way through the mid 90s to gut the interiors of historic houses. And some of the people would take all the trim and keep it, strip it off the wall, and then put it back in. But it's problematic from a couple different standpoints. Is that you can't get the soundproofness and you can't get the thermal mass from drywall that you get from plaster. And the jambs, that's the frame the door closes into, and the jambs on the window, that's the frame the window goes up and down in, stick out 1 inch to 1.5 inches for the lath and the plaster. So if you put 1/2 inch drywall on the wall, you've got the jambs sticking way out beyond. So when I do this, I'm actually putting 2 layers of 5/8 inch rock on the exterior walls, which brings that drywall out flush to the jamb so the trim can go right on it. If you don't, then you got to add a strip on the back of the trim, and it makes the trim look weird and all kinds of things. So it can be done. Yes, there's no question about it. Interior walls in the slave house, since we have guest rooms, and interior walls in the big house, we put in sound insulation on the interior walls so people can't hear from room to room. Because you know why people go to bed and breakfast. You use your imagination.
For the breakfast.
Oh my god.
Yeah, for breakfast, that's right.
That's a
My
good
wife
cook.
says that she and Maura are sex workers. They're like madams, right? Because everybody comes for their anniversary and all this.
I hope they're wearing feathers. I especially see Maura wearing feathers.
Yep, sure.
We have at our inn, we have all artists that help Pat with turning the rooms and all and cleaning, because they're all OCD, and my wife is like a clean freak. And so I have pictures of our friend Maura down on her knees with Q-tips and toothbrushes cleaning the inside of the baseboard and inside corner. And I'm like, Pat put that picture of Maura up on her website because it's so fantastic, you know. And then and she also had her COVID outfit on, so she wears like nurses wear those hats during surgery. She's got one of those big goggles and a double mask that she wears because she won't get vaccinated. So we said, okay. So she's like, you know, she almost looks like an alien landed in the house. It's pretty funny. But I respect it, you know, and we go along with all that. Any other questions as we go along here?
What should I do with my pressure washer?
Sell it on Facebook.
Well, you go to a lot of garage sales when you have.
Oh, you have no idea.
That's probably where she bought it.
What?
That's probably where you bought it.
Yeah.
I have one, but I usually just drag it around to show people why they shouldn't use it.
You can drag yours around. Yeah. Oh. Car tires.
Yeah, your car.
Let's talk about wood for a minute. So one of the things that I think is really important about wood is that we did something in this country which actually helped this country grow, which is we clear cut all these old first growth forests all over the country. You go out into Kentucky in the Appalachian Mountains, you go to Virginia, West Virginia, the Appalachian Mountains, and there's trees everywhere, but none of them are the first growth trees. They've all been cleared. And there's very few old growth forests. I mean, you can go to Sequoia, you can go to the redwood forests, but even the redwood forests have been decimated in many ways. They don't allow sequoia trees to be cut down. I mean, some of them are 4,000 years old, you know. I mean, it's just, they're unbelievable. And now that we know that the roots of trees actually communicate with other trees of different species within a forest, they actually communicate with each other. I just watched this documentary. I knew this, but I watched this documentary with the science behind it. Unbelievable. I had no idea that it was that extensive, this network of roots where they communicate with each other.
Talk to my plumber.
Huh?
Talk to my plumber.
Does he believe in that or what?
No, I had to hire a plumber to replace some line. and the tree roots have totally caught the whole thing.
Yeah, tree roots can be pretty damaging to sewer lines. There's no question about it. Bet he loves them. Yeah. So, old growth wood gets, as it gets older, the grain gets tighter, as it goes through droughts, as it goes through flooding, it goes through all these different environmental things. The tree gets hardier, the wood gets more rot resistant, and the grain gets tighter. The best cuts of wood are actually, you know, Avery's seen me draw this about 400,000 times. So you have a log, and 90% of the wood that you buy at the lumberyard, probably closer to 100% of the wood that you buy at Lowe's or Menards or any of these big chain lumber, you know, there's this thing called Home Depot. I mean, their colors are orange, and I'm like, I'm not going. Anyway, is what we call plain sawn. Plain sawn. And the way they cut it out of a log is like this. You have the grain going around like this. So you end up with a board that looks like this. And the grain is kind of floury on the face as well, like that. That's called plain sawn lumber. This is the most unstable cut of lumber there is. There's nothing worse. What ends up happening because of the grain strain of this cup here, I'm going to exaggerate this, but you can end up with a board like this.
Especially if you go to the fields.
Because of the way this grain works, like this. So all your 2x material, which I love, 2x material, right? So the 2x4 up until about 1900 was 2x4.
Yeah.
Right.
That's called nominal. And the industry decided to make it 1 7/8 by 3 3/4. And the federal government went after the lumber industry for fraud because they were still calling it a 2x4 or a 2x10, and they had reduced the size of the lumber. Well, what are the biggest lobbies in the country? The biggest lobby in the country that nobody knows about is the Vinyl, American Vinyl Institute. One of the top 5 is the NRA. You can think of other ones that. Money has too much influence, but it has always had too much influence in our politics. So the feds go after them, and they end up withdrawing from the whole thing and let the lumber industry do whatever they want. Now it's 1.5, right, by 3.5. It's pathetic. So, and they still call it a 2x4.
Yeah, right. And now the price is what, tripled in the last
at least.
year? Tripled?
Yeah, well, yeah. So I buy my Lowe's sells Doug fir from the Northwest. Really nice dimensional Doug fir. Very dry, coming out of the trucks into the lumber yard. Very clear, unbelievable. It makes great storm window product. Because we can take. Here's another example. Do you see over this here? If I take a 2x12. And it's like this. The bigger the wood, the older the tree. Right? A 2x12 has to come from a bigger tree than a 2x4. The average 2x4 through 2x8 is coming from a tree that's about 12 years old. The average 2x12 is coming from a tree that's between 40 and 60 years old. Big difference, right? We can actually cut off this edge, and we end up with what's called quarter sawn lumber. And this is how they quarter a log to get quarter sawn lumber. And the grain comes around like that, and the boards look like this. Straight grain on the end, straight grain on the face. That's called quarter sawn. That's the most stable cut of wood there is. There is no other cut of wood. You see quarter sawn, a lot of people are familiar with the term quarter sawn because of white oak and red oak that you see in a lot of arts and crafts era houses with the wood rays that look like tiger striping or whatever you want to call it. That's quarter sawn, but you can quarter saw any wood. And so if I take this piece of 2x12 and I cut these strips off the edges, I end up with a piece of quarter sawn that I can make wood storms out of. I can do anything I want. Because according to the Wood Engineering Handbook, which is done by the National Forest Service, they are our go-to scientists for wood. That's where all the industry go. That's where we learn about what moisture contents in wood have to be for effective painting, 15% or less. That's where we learn about paint adhesion, what woods are the best for paint adhesion. And they are Western red cedar, and they are cypress, and I don't know if I got that spelled right, probably not. And Doug Fir are in the top 5. So, Doug Fir is an excellent exterior wood, but if it's real young growth, 10 to 20 years old, it'll rot away. That's why I go buy 2x12s, which went an 8-foot 2x12, Doug Fir, beautiful lumber, still stocked like there's no shortage. The mills never stopped making wood, and the companies never quit cutting down wood during COVID. But the demand became so high during COVID because everybody's sitting around looking at their houses going, oh, I need to do this, I need to do that. And there is no shortage of lumber. It's all about demand, right? And so the prices have gone up. So that 2x12 8-foot was costing me $13, and now it's costing me $26, which is a huge difference. And I bid doing 27 storm windows for a guy 6 months ago. And I mean, my lumber costs are not a huge part of it. It's mostly labor, but it's still, will affect the bottom line on that job. No question about it. So that's really important. Now here's a couple examples. I like to pass these around in this order. So this shows that all of this is quartered, or what we call rift. Look at the grains on it. So rift is just like quartered. But the center board coming out of this quartered piece is pure like that, and then the other pieces around it can be more like this, at an angle. But it's still straight grain. So, and that's called rift. So what happened to all the rain? This is fabulous.
I know, the sun is.
We didn't pay the bill.
It's actually getting warm.
What wood is this?
That's all Doug Fir. And you can see that one, the piece with the tightest wood,
2x12.
Yeah.
right? That's over. So old growth, what we consider old growth wood in the wood industry today has to be 60 years or older. If it's 60 years or older, it's going to have the tight grain that you'll see on that piece and the stack that's just tighter than a tick. And that's brand new. I buy that from a place called All True Fir. ALTRUFIR. All True Fir. It's online. And they are a broker of Doug Fir. And they have relationships with all these family-owned fir farms in Oregon, Washington, and up in Canada. Up in there. And the relationship with these families are tree farms that back around the turn of the 20th century decided to go on a 60-year cycle. And now every year they have 60-year-old wood. And so I buy my cedar clapboard from those farms, and I buy my Doug Fir through All True Fir. I have a cedar broker, literally have a cedar broker in Chicago, and I call him up and I say, I've got to resize, and he sends me on a flatbed truck for the same amount of money I can buy plain sawn garbage from Menards. He sends me this.
Sorry, I was trying to get his done.
And you see how straight grain that is? That's heart cedar. It's quarter sawn, or what they call in the siding industry vertical grain. It's just a fabulous product. And that's what this is too.
My house is made out of cedar,
Yeah, cedar.
and it's
As a developer who buys historic properties that everybody wants to tear down, because that's my favorite thing to do, is to find out what they want torn down and go buy them and show them that they can be cost effectively rehabbed. That's my thing. My house, there were 2 developers that wanted to tear it down and build a high-rise low-income housing project. And they were really pissed when they found out that I found the guy that owned it in California and got it before they did. But that's okay. So anyway, cedar. So I think that cedar is pretty amazing, and so is that Doug Fir. And I'm not paying much more than anybody else pays for just crappy stuff. but you got to buy a bunch of it to get the price. So I use that Doug fir on all my porches that I restore and or build to reproduce porches, and it just holds up really well. One of the things that I want you to notice about this, thank you, sir, is this is the stuff that comes from that All True Fir company. Is that the bottom is oil prime. The tongue is oil primed, and even the inside of the groove is oil primed, but not the face, because all the best oil-based porch enamels don't want you to put it over primer. In fact, the warranty on the paint will be voided if you do. They want you to use that paint as your first coat, your second, and your third coat. And I use this. This is called Pratt & Lambert. It's called Withstand. It's an alkyd floor enamel. We use it on interior floors. We use it on porch floors. It's absolutely fabulous. It's smelly, and it holds up incredibly well.
Do you have all this on the handout?
Yeah, some of
like
it
the
is on
products
there.
that you get.
Is that the handout?
This is today's handout, which again was delivered to everybody, but if you don't have it, I can print it. Much smaller than yesterday's handout.
All True Fir is not on there
Okay.
because I just discovered them 2 years ago. And I've been doing this a long time, so I should update my handouts. So let's see, where was I?
Paint.
Yeah, paint. We're talking about paint. I know. So here's the thing about paint. I talk to the chemists at multiple paint companies every year, and one of the things that I said this a little bit yesterday, but one of the things I want to know is, since the EPA is wanting to outlaw oil-based paints, how's it going with primer technology and latex water-based primers? And every year they tell me the same thing. We can't figure out a way to make it work and soak into the old wood and condition it, because latex just lays on the surface and they just can't get it to bite. So that's important, I think. Then what I use in domestic paint is this. This is called Benjamin Moore's number 100 Fresh Start, and it's what we call a long oil. It's not a fast dry oil. Fast dry oils, you can put them on and probably paint them 6 hours later. This you have to let sit overnight, which is not a big deal, but it soaks in better. And I add 1/8 of a cup when we're painting exteriors, 1/8 of a cup of boiled linseed oil to this primer. And it just really penetrates beautifully then. Even more so than it does a great job without it, but it's just something extra that I've added over the years, and it's compatible with that. So when Sherwin-Williams, which has the lowest solid content paint for exterior work of any of the companies, they make the least resins. It's watered down compared to Benjamin Moore. Benjamin Moore has the highest solid content of any domestic paint company. And I don't know if you guys have a Benjamin Moore dealer. Sometimes Aces sell Benjamin Moore.
No, not
It just depends.
we have the Sherwin-Williams.
Yeah, they're everywhere.
You can order it
When you say
and they
solid
pre-ship it
content.
to you.
Yeah. So and it's interesting because in Illinois this is outlawed.
What?
Because it's oil.
Because Illinois, Massachusetts, and California opted into a voluntary program with the EPA as a test to start outlawing oils. So my Benjamin Moore dealer's in Illinois. So he orders this and has it shipped to my house, and then I bring it over for tinting if I need to. And that's the way I'm able to get around. Because in Missouri you can buy anything. Because we don't believe in government in Missouri.
So the Benjamin Moore is the primer,
Yeah, that's the primer that I use.
and what's the Pratt & Lambert? Oh, that's the porch.
That's a
stuff.
porch
That's a
enamel
floor.
oil. And it just does a fantastic job.
No.
What's the brush cleaner for the
Yeah.
wrist?
The brush cleaner? Yeah, we're using thinner, just
roll.
paint thinner.
Where do you?
Oh, just regular paint thinner?
Yeah, for which, you said roller?
For the Pratt & Lambert. Like if I'm painting onion roof porch,
Right.
just roll it on.
You roll it on. let's talk about that for a second, because I think that's a really good thing to talk about. I want to get back to how we strip houses, but one of the things that I did, again, because we had the money to do it on PBS, is we took a house that was going to be torn down and we cut a section out, clapboard, sheathing, studs, and 2 equal-sized pieces. And we cleaned them. We took all the paint off the clapboard, and we cleaned them, and then we oil primed both of them, and we put 2 top coats of a high-end acrylic latex top coat over the oil. You can always put latex over oil, but you can never put oil over latex. Something to remember. You can always put latex over oil, but you can't put oil over latex. It's just weird how the chemistry works, and I don't exactly understand it, but that's just...
Even after priming it?
So,
Even after priming it for oil?
so if you prime with oil, you can put latex over the top of it.
He means if you
The opposite.
prime the latex, you just put the oil over then.
No.
No, they can't. Like beer, wine. How does that thing go?
Something like, yeah.
Beer before wine.
So we took these
You
two
know
sections,
this,
and we painted them with the identical products, but the difference is that we sprayed one and we brushed one. And we then we shipped it to a lab, and we said we want to know a couple things. First of all, which one adhered to the wood the best, and which one has the best mill thickness, because we get wind-driven rain and sleet here, and it wears the paint film down. So the thicker you can get it on without it dripping and being a problem, the better. And of course, it came back, the mill thickness of the brush was, like 8 times more thickness for 2 top coats. And the adhesion was 6 times better with the brush than it was with the spray. That's amazing. So in order, you'd have to spray a house almost 10 times to get the same thickness as 2 brushed on with a big 4-inch brush like this. Because it works it into the wood, right? So then I have some painters say, well, I roll and then I back brush. Okay, let's think about that for a minute. So you're rolling the paint on and then you're back brushing. Are you using a dry brush? Because if you're using a dry brush, you're taking paint off.
Right.
You might be working it in a little better, but you're taking paint off. So if you're going to roll and back brush, you really have to stick this into the paint, and then what's the point, right?
Why roll it?
Twice.
Huh?
Why roll it?
Yeah,
Right.
right. I'm working through the logic here a little bit. For many, many years, I oil primed, and then I used Benjamin Moore's very best exterior acrylic latex top coats, and I still use that on siding. I still use it on siding and the exterior trim, but I don't use it on windows or doors anymore. I use strictly an oil-based paint for windows and doors, and that's this. This is called Super Spec, and it's interesting because it's really the only oil-based exterior paint that Benjamin Moore still makes. And it was originally designed to be a direct-to-metal paint.
Wow.
So you get the metal all cleaned up and then you can paint it. And when I do these special restoration projects, so the National Park Service calls me up and there's like, can you come to Minidoka, Idaho, out in the middle of nowhere, drop everything you're doing and come and restore all the windows and rolling barn doors on this community center? I'm like, no. I can't drop everything. I'm booked out 1.5 years, 2 years in advance. They said, okay, well, what if we take all the windows out and all the doors and we ship them to your shop? I'm like, you do that? I could fit it in if you did that. And sure enough, a week later, here comes a flatbed truck with all this stuff on it. What was interesting about that job was that the architects that were working with the Park Service spec'd out that they wanted oil, and so I suggested this, and they're like, well, Benjamin Moore doesn't make an oil. And they did the research and went, oh my God, this stuff is even better on wood than it is on metal. So now that's what they're using. And it is really a fabulous paint. And it takes about half as much paint to coat wood than a regular acrylic latex paint. It has so much solid content. It's so thick, it just goes on nicely. What was interesting about that job was that it was a Japanese internment camp in Idaho. And the Park Service took possession of Minidoka, and the Japanese carpenters built this community center. And when I got the doors and the windows, it was all Japanese joinery with all these multiple interlocking joints and all this stuff. And some of it was rotted, so I had to source Idaho Doug fir, because that's what they were made out of, and reproduce these interlocking joints. It was absolutely a riot. It's more fun than I've had in a long time. But trying to shoehorn 10-foot by 5-foot sliding barn doors into my walkout basement shop was a little tricky, but we got it done.
What did you say that, how much of the linseed oil did you put in the fresh
Eighth of a
starter?
cup.
Eighth of a cup.
In a gallon.
On the super spec, what primer do you use?
We use the Benjamin Moore Alkyd.
Okay, because I had a painter tell me one time if I was going to use a paint that was made to paint metal, that I had to use an acid-based primer before I used that paint.
Well, no,
He didn't specify material.
Well,
He
direct to
just-
metal paint is designed to not have a primer. That's why they call it direct to metal.
Okay.
And so, but talking to the chemists at Benjamin Moore, when I first started using this, they said their #1 Alkyd primer, and I've been using it now for a while. But here's the other side of it that's really interesting. So what is the percentage of labor on preservation projects that you think goes into a preservation project?
80%.
90.
Right? So on average nationwide, it's 73.5% of preservation projects go to labor. Very little in material costs compared to new construction, which runs 40% labor, 60% materials. So we're actually creating more jobs in preservation. And it gets a bad rap because it's so labor intensive, but material costs are insignificant in many cases. And in painting, they're really insignificant because it's all about the prep. And so when I spec'd this and this at George Washington's Mount Vernon, and they said, no, we don't want, it's good paint, but we want you to use fine paints of Europe. I'm like, holy shit, I don't know if you've ever heard of this stuff, but we did some experiments with it. It has the highest solid content in it of any paint on the planet. It's European, these people don't like to have to repaint stuff, right? And Mount Vernon cut a deal with Fine Paints of Europe that they could have a George Washington palette and Mount Vernon gets free paint for life. So
Wow.
that was more of the motivation for me to use it, but it costs $160 a gallon.
Nuh-uh. It's not
That's
that
more
much
than
more than
Walmart.
Sherwin-Williams.
Well, I'm at my contractor discount, I'm paying like close to $60 a gallon for this and 50 for this primer. And so what's astonishing is that it went twice as far as Benjamin Moore. I had figured so much Benjamin Moore for so many windows. You know, I'm very good at calculating my paint costs. And I got out there and I used it, and I used half the paint I would have used with Benjamin Moore. So what's half that? That's down, now you're down to $80
Right,
a gallon,
80,
right?
Yep.
And that's what, $20 more a gallon than probably you're going to pay. But it's insignificant because over 70, sometimes as high as 85% of the time in a paint job goes to prep. So why not use the best paint you can get your hands on? Like I said yesterday, Warren Buffett bought Benjamin Moore to keep Sherwin-Williams from ruining the company because they were going to buy it.
Oh, wow.
And thank you, Warren Buffett. What a fine young man. So, there's that. Now, any other questions so far on paint? Sherwin-Williams makes a paint that sticks better than any paint on the market for exterior. And this is it. This is called Duration. Anybody heard of Duration? So Duration is an elastomeric coating. Now, what that means is elastomeric coatings were designed to paint metal roofs, built-in metal gutters. It has zero vapor permeability. Latex and even oil-based paint, standard alka-based paints, have some vapor permeability. So as the moisture is trying to get out of the inside of the wall to the outside, it can permeate through the paint film without damaging it. This stuff sticks like iron. It's being used on historic clapboard and trim, porch parts all over the country. It's being used on brick, masonry buildings all over the country. So we went on a tour about 5 years ago to look at houses that had had it on for 2 to 3 years. And here's what we found. It's stuck like iron, and in about 3 years, the hydrostatic pressure, that's all the moisture building up behind the paint film, blew it off with the face of the bricks and the face of the clapboard, and the face of the trim came off with it because it sticks so tight. It's one of the most damaging paints on the market. And again, it's like shooting yourself in the foot. If you're watering down your paint formulas that have lower solid contents, and you're selling one that has such a high solid content that it's not vapor permeable, instead of finding some sweet spot in between, you're driving this market. Because people get fed up with paint jobs not lasting, and they start to put replacement siding on, which makes the problem worse. All right, I'm going to take a 5-minute break, and when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about architectural epoxy wood repairs. And then we're actually going to replace some siding today and do some epoxy repairs around the building, talk about different ways to repair cracks in siding.